بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to Fit for Ramadan with me, Jehad Shamis, on Radio Ramadan 87.9 FM. We are online at ramadanradio.org and streaming on Facebook. If you have any questions, text messages, you can WhatsApp as well with your feedback or comments. The number is 077 614 60614. That's 077 614 60614. Alhamdulillah, we're here on Radio Ramadan this year. MashaAllah, we've been asked to do a couple of slots on fitness and sport and well-being, inshallah. We hope everyone is having a blessed and fruitful Ramadan so far. We are now, I guess, about maybe 5 or 6 days into it, and I hope everyone is feeling the effects of the blessed month already, and they haven't got themselves too tired too early. Inshallah, we're going to talk about how to pace ourselves in this blessed month, both physically and spiritual as well, so we can get the maximum from the end, inshallah ta'ala. So this slot is named Fit for Ramadan, and the idea is that each week I'll have a different guest and we'll be focusing on, I guess, sunnah disciplines, sunnah activities, sunnah sports, whatever you like to call it, in a way to encourage people to adopt a particular sunnah activity, not just in Ramadan, but also after Ramadan and something more long-term in their life as well. We have a number of very interesting and exciting guests. Most of them are personal friends of mine and people I benefit from myself. We will have people who talk about horse riding, people who are talking about archery. We're trying to get someone on swimming, inshallah, personal trainer. But today I'm very happy to have a close friend and a teacher of mine. He is a Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He has a club out in West London, and his brother Nisar Sheikh. So, Brother Nisar, Jazakallah khair. Thank you for joining me. Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Brother Jihad, how are you? Well, you guys hear me okay?
Alhamdulillah. Good to see you again, mashallah. And I hope the month is doing well for you so far, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. Very, very blessed month, very wonderful time. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you again on the show.
Alhamdulillah, no problem. I'm just going to start off with a hadith that are probably known to many people. A reminder for myself and everyone else. I will try to bring a different hadith, but related to, being fit and being a strong Muslim, etc., etc. So this one is from the collection of Sahih Muslim, and it is where the Prophet ﷺ said, "A strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than a weak believer, and there is good in both." This is part of a longer hadith, but this is just the first I wanted to bring out, where the Prophet ﷺ is highlighting the importance of being a strong believer. And depending on a person's circumstance, you may look at it as being strong physically, mentally, spiritually, psychologically, etc. And as believers, we want to follow the footsteps of the Prophet in as much as we can. And obviously, he was the perfect example of how we should be. And so here, from our perspective for this particular show, we're talking about physical fitness and the importance of physical fitness being a form of worship as well, and helping us to worship Allah to the best of our ability. It's not just physical fitness for the sake of physical fitness, or looking good, or getting a particular belt, whatever it might be, in our particular discipline. But we definitely have a higher goal. So, mashallah, Brother Nisar, I've known for a number of years now. He first introduced me to Jiu-Jitsu, so he was definitely my first teacher in that. We're going to talk about his background, his introduction into Jiu-Jitsu. We're going to talk about, not in any particular order, but we'll talk about his training in Ramadan. Does he train? And if so, why? You know, a lot of people have kind of what we like to call Ramadanitis. So when when Ramadan comes around, everyone becomes kind of everyone, we suddenly become very weak. We can't do this, we can't lift this, we can't do that, we can't do our normal physical activities because we're fasting. But is that really the case? Is that just a mindset? And we'll discuss that as well. We will talk about his mashallah, he's kind of helped authored and published a book on the Sunnah of wrestling. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk about some of our previous trips abroad on the Fatua program as well. Obviously, that's been on pause for the last couple of years, or 2 years, last year and this year because of COVID, but inshallah, we hope that will resume next year, inshallah. And just a general chat about the benefits of jiu-jitsu and why has he dedicated and sacrificed a lot of his time and his life for this particular sport. Also, women's role in jiu-jitsu. Can sisters get involved? Can girls, or should they get involved in jiu-jitsu? All these type of things. So if people do have any questions, comments, or anything, inshallah, the number to use or WhatsApp is 077 614 60614, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, bismillah. So, Brother Nisar, let's kind of go back in time a little bit. Just tell us a little bit about, firstly, for those who don't even know, because we are aware of what jiu-jitsu is, but there might be a number of people out there who've never heard of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, BJJ. Just give us a brief rundown. What is it? And then tell us about your journey and your intro into that world, please.
Sure. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Jiu-Jitsu comes from Japan. I mean, there's a lot of dispute as to its origins. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specifically is an amalgamation of the grappling arts that was inherited from the Japanese that found its way into Brazil. And we would argue that the Brazilians really developed it over a number of years, perhaps over the last century or so. And you could liken it to wrestling, to judo, but with a very, very specific emphasis on ground grappling. So if you were to take a confrontation or a fight, and a lot of people beyond the strikes and the kind of tugging and pulling, sometimes, well, more often than not, the fight will go to the ground. And what do you do from there? And this is where jiu-jitsu, this is what jiu-jitsu specializes in, is in the ability to control an opponent on the ground and then submit them by way of a choking technique or a locking technique. So that's essentially what it is. It's very, very hard, Brother Jehad, as you know, to pinpoint, and we make a lot of claims in history as to who started what and who was the founder, and that is really, really disputed throughout jiu-jitsu. But we can credit the Brazilians in perhaps the last century for their great development and their big hand in what we would now term BJJ, and it's a really interesting history as well. But essentially, that's what it is. It's like grappling. It's wrestling. For those of us who were familiar with the days of when you were in school and you were perhaps scrapping around with your friends, it's very similar to that, with the objective of submitting your opponent. The submission, and it's a very interesting term as well, is really bringing the fight to an end by either a devastating lock. It could be a leg lock, it could be an arm lock, or rendering someone unconscious by means of a choke. So that's essentially what jiu-jitsu is.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. Yeah, very interesting. You mentioned that that it ends in a submission, and let's talk about that a little bit later on. But we'll try and link the relevance of that to it being kind of an Islamic art as well, and the discipline and the history of that, because I think a lot of people, even in this day and age, are still quite unaware of the strong link that I guess jiu-jitsu or wrestling has in our Islamic history as well, inshallah. You run, mashallah, a club out in West London. Tell us a little bit about where the club is based, and how you managed to run it there successfully.
Cool. So just a little bit, just going maybe a step back. I started jiu-jitsu. I came into grappling way back in kind of 2002, 2003, at the what's now known as Carlson Gracie London. It's one of the most premier clubs in the country. In fact, uh, I would probably term myself one of the old school people here. We're now in 2021, and I started many, many years ago. I was a university student. I couldn't do a press up. I was very, very unfit. And I guess I came into it through a need or a desire to really know how to defend myself. And this, I think, a lot of people can kind of relate to, particularly men, young boys, perhaps as they're growing up, going through their school and college and university, and find themselves maybe a little bit insecure. I grew up in a very racist area, right opposite Heathrow Airport, and I found myself quite frequently being involved in a lot of fights. So that's kind of the backdrop as to why I got involved into martial arts. And I was very, very fortunate to find my instructor, Wilson Jr. Wilson heads up Carlson Gracie London, and back then it was in Earl's Court in West London. Since that time, obviously, in 2014, I got my black belt after 10 years or so of training. And in Jiu-Jitsu, there are 5 grades, 5 belts that you go through. You go from white, blue, purple, brown, and then black. And then beyond black, there are different degrees, as they call them, or perhaps people would refer to them as dans, first degree, second degree, etc. After I got my black belt, I mean, even before that, I've always been teaching. From my blue belt days, I've always been teaching in the club. I was teaching at Carlson's for the longest time. Just yesterday, I went back to one of my old places of teaching in Farnborough, Carlson Gracie Farnborough, where I taught from a purple belt. You know, I was there for about 5 or 6 years. It was a wonderful time. I've seen the development of a lot of people. And then I was teaching locally in some Muslim organizations, and more recently, where we founded locally a mosque, ASCC, we call that Masjid Noor, which is based in Heathrow Airport, directly opposite Terminal 4. If anybody wishes to pop down, you'll see us as being maybe the very first mosque to lay down grappling mats on the floor, which is what we pray on, and then the rugs move away, and that's where we grapple as well. Inshallah, in the hope of perhaps reviving grappling as a sunnah. And this is where I founded what we call Uswa Jiu-Jitsu. Uswa Jiu-Jitsu, Carlson Gracie 302. The name Uswa comes from the verse in the Quran in which Allah refers to the Prophet as Uswatul Hasana, the most beautiful example. So Uswa is the example or the exemplar that we follow. And verily we have in the Messenger of God the most beautiful example, Surah Al-Ahzab. So that's where the name comes from. And alhamdulillah, you know, it's been running, you know, for a number of years now. And it's been very successful in as much as it's allowed people a safe space to come and train in the mosque, in a community-based setting, a number of times a week. I actually teach in 3 different locations. One is at the mosque in Ashford, the second one is in Slough, and the third is in High Wycombe. And I, you know, alhamdulillah, I'm very honored and blessed to have students at all 3 locations or different locations, and it's been running really, really well. So really, the intent for me behind all of this is not for, I guess, the usual objectives that many people have. It's a martial arts club in as much as it, obviously we're teaching jiu-jitsu, we're teaching grappling. I have a background also in judo, in wrestling. I wrestle quite frequently now with national wrestling coaches and national level judokas. But it's more a case of what can we take from grappling as almost a religious practice. And I think this is what Brother Jehad you were referring to when we talked about kind of the spiritual elements of these sunnah arts. or arts that were practiced by the Prophet ﷺ and his Sahaba, and really beyond the physical, what is it that we can gain from? So that's just a bit of background into the club and ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Masha, I think, to have a mosque where you have the judo mats underneath the prayer mat is probably more of a rarity than a norm nowadays. But I think you guys are, mashallah, leading the way in that, and we do hope more mosques can maybe adopt that type of setup where it will encourage a lot of youth, youngsters to come into the mosque. Because no doubt, I mean, I know personally you've had a lot of people, drawn to the mosque through the jiu-jitsu class, and it's an amazing form of da'wah as well. They would never have come to the mosque had it not been for that. So full credit to you for that. Let's talk about training in Ramadan. Whenever Ramadan comes around, food is always a big issue. Sleepless nights, never having enough energy, and so people automatically think that I have to do less gym work or less physical activity. What is your routine? Does it change in Ramadan? Does it ramp up? Does it go down a little bit? And is training, in your point of view, good or bad during Ramadan?
I think, Brother Jihad, in Ramadan, there should be a degree with which your physical activity is somewhat reduced, but not stopped. And you're right, there is this kind of Ramadanitis where everything stops for us in Ramadan, and we feel completely fatigued. And yes, the first few days are really, really difficult. The mouth is dry, you've got headaches, and you're just not feeling like you want to do anything physical. And you end up finding people sleep a lot of the time during the day in Ramadan. And this is really counter to what we understand, number one, about the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his Sahaba. In fact, they were very, very active during Ramadan. And I don't need to tell you or our listeners about the great battle of Badr, which took place in the month of Ramadan. If you can just conceive of that, to go into battle at a time when you're fasting, with weaponry, with armaments, to consider that moment in Ramadan is something that's beyond many of us now. So then when we think about, should I stop my gym membership, or I'm not going to do my daily jog, or I'm not going to get on the bike because it's Ramadan, I think is a bit, it's not appropriate for us as believers. Also, the studies that were shown, and I have to credit my brother Sufyan Yunus, who recently did a small workshop on nutrition in Ramadan. About a third of Muslims in this country actually put on weight in the month of Ramadan, and this is really incredible because even with just perhaps having one meal a day, how are we putting on weight? And that's through a lack of activity. Yeah, a lot of our ailments, a lot of our problems in Ramadan come from complete lack of activity, whereas this was counter to what the Muslims did. And you mentioned that beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the strong believer, and that requires us to make effort, particularly when it's difficult. Ramadan shouldn't be a time when you stop physical activity. My personal thing is that we just reduce the number of times perhaps that we're training. And this is something that I would advise people to do all the time, is that, if you're used to training perhaps 4 or 5 times a week, let's knock that down. If you're used to only training maybe once a week, I think you should still maintain that, having some physical activity, going for your walks, going for your jogs. Myself, we still grapple. The method that I have found, and I've been doing this consistently now for the last 10 years, not just myself, but my students as well. And they find themselves actually performing better in the month of Ramadan because the body it becomes very efficient at using every ounce of energy, every calorie, every carbohydrate that your body carries. When you've got almost nothing left in the system, it's the most efficient machine you can imagine. Efficient physically, mentally, the clarity that you have in Ramadan. Again, there are stories of Socrates, and he would consider increasing, when he wanted to increase his mental capacity, he would fast.
Mm.
And this is really, really important as it relates to Ramadan, that you will really surprise yourself as to how much you can do with a fast if you try. Just yesterday, we had a session of grappling and we arrived 10 minutes before Maghrib. MashaAllah, beautiful. The brothers, obviously socially distanced. We came in together. We had a light iftar. This is another point to talk about, is that iftars, commonly are huge, big, extravagant occasions. And you've got the samosa and you've got, soups and biryani and, it's all coming up. This is not the approach that we take. And again, going back to the prophetic example, food was not that abundant at that time. So your iftar is very, very light. Dates, water, perhaps some fruit, maybe some juice. We would pray Maghrib, and that's it. We start off with a light warm-up, some kinesthetics, some movement, getting a light sweat going, and then moving into techniques, and then moving into live sparring. By the end of the session, not only are you fully energized, but you've almost forgotten that you fasted for the whole day. You did a 16, 17-hour fast, and we've just had waters on the side. At any time you want to break, you can break and have your water and have a sip and have a chunk of watermelon or whatever it is that you need. So I think it's really important that people don't stop. And in fact, it's for those who perhaps never do any physical activity, Ramadan is a beautiful time to start, because you're actually at the most optimum time. A lot of people go on diets and stuff outside of Ramadan, and then they do the gymming. You are in the most, wonderful state physically, because you're not you shouldn't be intaking as much as you would outside. So why not start now? That's my point.
%. No, definitely. I mean, you to train during Ramadan, even if it's at a lower degree, still feel, like you say, that clarity, and that boost of energy as well, which is quite strange. People normally think that, if I'm not taking in food, I have less energy, therefore I will have less output. But that's not necessarily the problem. Okay, we've got a quick question coming here. Does lack of substantial food cause fatigue with jiu-jitsu session after iftar? Very good question. Because this is just what we were saying, right? So that, we think that we have less food, and, we're at the end of the day, my body's already fatigued. How is it that I can, do a session that lasts an hour or an hour and a half, and perform, not necessarily at the peak, but perform well? So what's your view on that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, iftar, a very light iftar, you will surprise yourself how well the body works on very little food. You have to also remember the amount of resources, physical, biological resources that go into digesting food. So when you're having a light iftar, dates, water, some fruit, that is sufficient for you then to mobilize yourself for some physical activity, be it jiu-jitsu, be it grappling, wrestling, boxing, going for a run, any physical activity. It doesn't require a lot. I'm really against this kind of culture of eating where, I've got to carb up, I've got to have my protein. Your body is a very efficient machine and specimen, and it knows what it needs. And in fact, it needs less. Less is more, in my view. Yes, like the Jehad you just mentioned, you're not optimum. Obviously, you're not going to be as strong, as energetic as perhaps when you're not fasting. But believe me, I mean, the practice, all that we've done, that we've seen, is that people are actually more energized in the month of Ramadan when they eat less. And it's not a requirement. This last point I want to make is that it's not really. You're kind of deceiving yourself a little bit by thinking that you need to eat, constantly, or you need to have a substantial amount of food in order to perform physically. Many of us are carrying a lot of excess baggage, a lot of excess calories, and we would do well just to work off very little, especially in the month of Ramadan.
And you know, from what I've heard, people I've spoke to, that you know, if you're fasting, intermittent fasting, whatever it might be, you break your fast with something small, and then you do some training. That's actually a very good way of reducing fat and you know, cutting out calories and things like that, right? It's a good way.
Absolutely, it's the most effective way. I mean, you can take professional UFC MMA fighters, and you see their, you know, when they're cutting weight. You know, you can look to famous boxers, Mike Tyson. These guys, they would have very little, you know, literally, you know, like, you know, a glass of milk as an example. I remember the, you know, days of Mike Tyson when he was training. A glass of milk, 5 o'clock in the morning, and he'd go out and he'd do his, you know, 5 mile or 10 mile run. He'll come back and do his exercises. Yes, perhaps he's having, you know, glasses of water to stay hydrated, you know, in that period. But then you would have your meal after having worked out. It's almost like you have to earn your meal through some sort of workout. For us, particularly in the modern context, and we really got to look to that and understand that holistically, as opposed to feeling that we always need to have something and then burn that off. You know, you've got a lot of inherent energy bound up in you already, and I think it's important. You know, I mean, you know, I don't like to mention his name, but I want to say it anyway. Joe Rogan, you know, he's a really big advocate of jiu-jitsu, and he's been training it for a long time. Some of the guests that he has on his show, and I know a lot of the brothers and maybe even the sisters are, you know, they look to them. You know, I personally don't like to listen too much to his podcast, but if you know, the likes of Steve Maxwell, very famous, one of the earliest black belts in America, he was once asked on the Joe Rogan show, you know, you're almost, you know, 70 years old now, and you claim for 50 years having not gone to the doctor for any ailment. What do you do? You know, when you're sick, when you're not well, when you're tired. This guy has been training his entire life. Steve Maxwell is a very famous grappler, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. He said, whenever I'm injured, whenever I'm low, I fast. And he goes, I fast like the ancients, and I fast like the Persians, he said. And he made reference to Islam, and it was, you know, really interesting. And it's really sad that sometimes Muslims only ever listen to the prophetic advice when it's told from unprophetic people, or people who perhaps don't share our faith. And then we perk up and say, oh yeah, you know, the 2-5 diet, or, you know, intermittent fasting. And it's just, you know, it's all there. It's all there in the life of the Prophet.
So very much, you know, I guess we could sum that up. Less is more, in terms of, you know, the less we have, the less intake we have, we can get more out of the body. Yeah.
Absolutely, less is more. Absolutely.
Less is more. Excellent. Someone also asked, is it because, you know, in terms of fat burning, is it because the body is in a keto state? For people that don't know, if you could maybe just kind of summarize what is keto, and is it beneficial? Is it something that we should look into? And is it a good way of kind of losing weight?
Yeah, I think it really, for me, it's about your objective, your intention. What is it that we're trying to gain? And oftentimes, I think, in as much as Ramadan is a spiritual time, and because we feel it physically, sometimes these other goals creep in. And yeah, ketones and going to keto, you know, keto status, and, you know, how efficiently we're burning fat and whatever. It's important, you know, for people who feel the need, and perhaps are, you know, maybe they consider themselves overweight or find themselves struggling physically. But I think more than that is understanding, what do you intend by doing that? And you alluded to this earlier, is that, are we going to the gym to look a certain way? Are we doing a physical activity to feel a certain way? You know, and I think even for example, the martial arts, we talk about the martial arts. Why are we doing the martial arts? Is it so that we can brag and say that, you know, I can beat you up, I'm able to bench press, you know, 200 kg, I can box all day long, you know, I've had, you know, 55 MMA fights and never had a loss? What is the intention behind why we do things? And when you question that truly, and you really reflect, that's where I think the answers come from. If the answers to those questions are other than Allah and His Messenger, and I'm not saying that, you know, in any kind of grandioso sense, i.e., if we really want to progress in our spiritual strivings towards Allah and towards having the Prophet ﷺ as our uswa, as our example, then how much of what we do is aligned to that? And that is what's really important. I think, sometimes when you've got these goals, oh, you know what, by Ramadan, I want to lose 20 kg, or I want to lose 10 kg. I want to be able to fit into these jeans, or look a certain way. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think it's really important that you go back and say, actually, you know what, I want to improve myself so that I can do more worship, that I'm able to, instead of not being able to pick up my children when they want to go to the park, I want to get to a state where I'm able to play with my children. Many of us, parents, we're big advocates of, I got to get my son swimming, and I'm going to send my son to the local cricket club and he's going to be the best cricketer. And, we've got all these grand things that we want to do for our children, yet we don't do it for ourselves. Some of us struggle going up and down the stairs, and this is no slight on anybody. I know what that's like. It's a difficult thing, but we need to align our intentions and our goals with greater, loftier goals, loftier objectives, and not just superficial, vain pursuits. To look a certain way, or feel a certain thing. So I think if you kind of recalibrate how you look at things, that will really, really help you not only achieve your goals in whatever it is. Superficially they're important. Health, getting your cholesterol down, blood sugar levels for those perhaps who are suffering with diabetes. If you're overweight, if you're not feeling well, some people are very slim but they don't feel good. They're mobile. Their bodies are immobile. They're not functional. These are very important things, but I think it's important to come back to the way of the Prophet ﷺ and why we want to do this, but then also do something that you enjoy to do, and that will then lead to a longevity in you continuing that beyond Ramadan, or beyond that initial goal. Because sometimes, very often, you'll find people, they may achieve a goal or small milestone and then they stop. And that can be the biggest thing, that, oh God, that's it, I've got my goal, but I'm still not fulfilled. So this is where it's really important to have a deep, lofty, noble intention.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think, if we have that higher intention, and ultimately it's about, we've been given this body as an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to look after it as best we can. If we think of it as a machine, we need to keep it well oiled and running well and well maintained. Why? So that we're able to do as much ibadah with that body as possible. And I think everything else will come with that. If you are maintaining that machine properly, as you should, your mental state will be good, your physical, you are going to look good at some point in your life. We're not going to be kind of overweight or obese. And as you mentioned earlier, in our communities, our Muslim communities, unfortunately, we're kind of have kind of the highest rate for things like diabetes and cholesterol and high blood and all that stuff. And so really something has to change, I think, in our in the way we look at sport and discipline and things like that. And you made a good point that, we do want to put our kids into certain activities, but you know what? We need to be putting ourselves first into those activities, and so that we can share that experience with the kids. I remember once I did an archery session somewhere, and I just did like a random question. I said, like, how many here, we were talking about Sunnah disciplines, how many people, and it was predominantly an Asian Asian ethnic group. I said, how many people here can swim? And I think, there's maybe say 20 people there, maybe 1 or 2 people put their hand up, and it was just a testament to, not their fault, but it was just a litmus test to see, they were just never exposed to swimming when they were young. They were just not put in swimming classes and things like that when they're growing up. And not to point fingers, but, things like that is something that's so embedded in the Sunnah, and many people don't really know about that. Let's just move quickly on to, you have a book that, mashallah, you've been working tirelessly to get published. Tell us about the relevance of that book, and now how jiu-jitsu or wrestling is really embedded in the history and the sunnah of Islam itself.
Yeah, so as you know, I've been kind of researching over the last couple of years, and I'm thankful to one of my teachers, Sheikh Thaqib Mahmood. I have to credit him with bringing it to my attention. There was a small booklet that very famous Imam Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, rahimahullah ta'ala, had written many centuries ago, and it is called in Arabic al-Musara'a ila al-Musara'a. We kind of translated that as swiftly to wrestling. And in that, there is a collection of 18 hadith as it relates to wrestling. And this is one of the kind of features or salient features of the way that Imam Suyuti wrote a lot of his works. And the collections aren't very, for perhaps the Western reader, conclusive. They're very nice for me as a grappler, and they basically identify the instances when the Prophet ﷺ would wrestle along with his Sahaba. So he'd bring the very famous incident with Rukana ibn Abi Yazid radiallahu ta'ala an, when he was considered at the time the most formidable strong man, grappler, wrestler of the Arabian Peninsula. And the Prophet ﷺ wrestled him on several occasions and overcame him very in a very amazing way, in almost a miraculous way. So this book initially was just a translation of this work, but I having read the translation and looked through it, I felt it needed a bit more of contextualization. So what we did was we annotated it, we gave it some context, and I did some research over a period of time to look into the history of wrestling in Islam. Now, sadly, I don't know how you found this with your archery, but the physical activities particularly in wrestling are quite limited from what I can gather. I don't know if we've got any listeners out there. If there's anybody who has more information or more details, I'm looking at primary source Arabic texts, and very little out there that I can glean. But what we have done is, alhamdulillah, we've managed to comment on these hadith. We've given some history into grappling in Arabia. We've talked about how the kind of different rules and cultures of grappling around Muslim cultures. So not only just Arabia, but even the Persian cultures, the Ottoman time, the Abbasid time. So some very interesting anecdotes that we found. And also then looking into what I would term the martial warriors of the golden age of Islam, i.e. the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, who were very much given to combat, to martial arts, and their wrestling. So this book is, inshallah, going to be published soon. I was just on the phone yesterday to the publisher. We were just going through some final kind of editing and elaborations that we've got to make. And also, what's included in there is what we're terming the objectives of sport in Islam. Why would we? And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be specific to grappling or to wrestling. Any sport, take any sport you like. What would a Muslim find or objectify? What are our objectives when we look at sport, when we undertake sport? Why would you do a sport as a Muslim? We're very disciplined people. We pray 5 times a day. We pay our charity. Our day is split up with azkar and dhikr and Quran, and we are disciplined in that way. But then what are the objectives when we approach a physical sport or something physically? And this is something also that I identify in the book that we talk about in the way that we approach sport or arts, physical arts. So it's just important, and I'll quickly wrap this up just to give the listeners a little feel that the objectives of sport, as we understand it from the Prophet ﷺ and our pious predecessors, were mainly 5. So you would have them engage in the likes of archery or the likes of grappling, swordsmanship, primarily for military function. You'd find them doing that because they were engaged in war, they were engaged in combat, and they would need to learn how to do that. So that was one objective as to why you would undertake something like a martial art. Number two, you would look into it
Right.
because of social and communal recreation. There are very, very many instances of the Prophet and the Sahaba that they would engage archery, they would engage wrestling, they would do these activities as a means of social cohesion. And you find that very often in Muslim lands. And I don't need to tell our listeners, if you get a bunch of brothers together, or even sisters who are very passionate about cricket, as an example, or even football, as it were, the house is roared down and they love it. It's a really passionate thing that we talk about. And we come together for that. How often do you get together with your friends to watch the World Cup, for example, or the 2020 cricket, or whatever the case is? This is also something that is very, very important when we look at the objectives of sport in Islam. The third one is skillful mastery. The Prophet ﷺ told us, Allah loves a servant who, when performing a task, does so skillfully. Al-itqan, as it's known in Arabic, and that's really just attaining mastery. And you know about this city because of your work with archery, that the many great, and you just have to look at the likes of Imam Shafi'i and Imam al-Bukhari. They were master archers. They took to mastery, not only in what they did off the archery field, but even on it. So they were not only master archers, and they had laser-like precision with their archery, but they were very much like that with their practice of their deen, and in the case of Imam Bukhari, with his hadith collection. The other element of the other objectives of doing a sport or a martial art or a physical activity in Islam would be for the refreshment of the body and the soul. Oftentimes, and Ramadan is a good example of that. I don't know how many ajza, juz, how much Quran people are reading now. Hopefully it's a lot, and Allah allow us to continue reading the Quran as much as possible. But after some time of a lot of ibadah, a lot of worship, you need to allow your body and your soul to be refreshed by almost, not mundane, but some other activity, and something else that will allow you to recalibrate your function. Break the norm. And it's really interesting because there's a nice narration by Abu Darda radiallahu ta'ala an, who would say that I entertain my heart with something trivial in order to make it stronger in the service of the truth. So it was almost like you have to have a bit of a release, and you go out and you shoot some arrows, or you wrestle with a friend and you get a sweat going, and you come back and you've had that release, and that was a good thing. And then you come back to your worship. Another objective, obviously, goes without saying, was self-defense. The Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba would engage in martial arts for reasons of self-defense. And I would argue, and this is part of the book, inshallah, is that maybe there's a sixth objective in that. If we look at these arts and we think deeply as to why we would do that, if none of the other objectives stood for us, or didn't apply to us now, we could say that some of these arts help us refine ourselves, help to refine our character, who we are as people. And this is something that many people, even people of no faith, or people who don't share our faith, can attest to. This is why I think maybe the point, if we have time to talk about it, that you may come on to, is what relevance does grappling have for Muslims, and how does it help us? It's this very last point, which is to refine our character and to make us better people, which is a very interesting topic in itself.
Absolutely. No, 100%. I mean, we could go a lot deeper and further into that. We just have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to touch upon a question and a topic. What relevance and where can we place our sisters, our mothers, our wives in jiu-jitsu? Do they have a place there? Can they do it? Is it something that's kind of off bounds for them, or what's your experience in that?
For me, I make no distinction between men, women, brothers, our sisters, our sons and our daughters, and there should be no difference in the way that we encourage both of them. It's really, really important, and we need to understand that not only from a point of fairness or equality, and the girls are just as good as the boys, but just understanding that humanity is made up of men and women, that are doing things all the time, together or individually. Yes, there's an understanding of physical difference that has to be completely understood, but there should be equal encouragement. And I found that in communities where girls are kind of left to the side, and oh no, she can sit pretty in the corner, and don't worry, we don't want to get her hijab too crinkly, and she's just going to make the cup of tea when people come through. No, we've got to break that kind of if that's a stereotypical view of our young girls. I don't think that's appropriate. I think really we should be encouraging them, making them stronger, making them fitter, and not to the extreme extent where they're excessively doing it, where they're hurting themselves, but an equal opportunity to just go and train and enjoy sports just like everybody else has. And you don't have to look any further than the great sahabiyat of this ummah. I really think, and I'm saying this to the brothers and all the men that are listening, is that we just think of the Sahaba as men and we forget the Sahabiyat. And this is, again, perhaps some reading for us to do in this month of Ramadan. It's a great book by our teacher, Sheikh Akram Nadwi, Hafizullah Ta'ala, Allah preserve him. He compiled a 40-volume work on the female scholars of Islam, Al-Muhaddithat it's called, right? And it's a really good book. The Muqaddimah is actually done in English, and you can read it. And in there, you've got the likes of Nusayba bin Ka'ab, radiallahu anha. She was, a woman of the Ansar. She was a martial artist through and through, knew how to use the sword, knew how to ride a horse, knew how to, shoot arrows. She defended the Prophet ﷺ, in many, many battles. You're looking at the likes of Khawla bint al-Azwar, radiallahu anha. If you look at, there's a book called Futuh al-Sham, it's attributed to al-Waqidi, that's disputed, but if you look at her, she goes ahead of Khalid bin Walid in battles, and she's defeating and destroying, men. She's just going out there, with her sword and cutting down men, and she's having, she's engaging in combat, and she's renowned as a great spear woman, as a great sword lady, an amazing individual. You've got the likes of the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, Safiya bint Abdul Muttalib, radiallahu ta'ala anha, where at the battle of Khandaq, where she was there, and Hassan bin Thabit, radiallahu anhu, he was not able, he didn't have the courage to go out and see the Jewish intruder outside the fort, and she was there, and she took a club and she took out the intruder. And it's these are the women that we look to, and I think should be encouragement for our sisters, for our mothers, for our daughters, to replicate, and it's really, really important. So I make no distinction, and if I had the opportunity, and inshallah, maybe just encouragement for my wife and the women of the community, really to encourage our young girls to partake in the martial arts and into sports just in general, all whilst doing it with great modesty and preserving their faith, and not contravening that.
Definitely. No, alhamdulillah, that was a perfectly timed answer, inshallah. Well, the time has got the better of us, as I thought it would. We would like to go on longer, but Brother Nisar, I appreciate your time. Allah bless your ending of your Ramadan and your days and your nights, inshallah. Keep us in your du'as. So Brother Nisar, he runs his jiu-jitsu club out in Staines, mashallah. May Allah preserve him and keep him going. We just want to wrap up very quickly with a small hadith, which is encouragement for myself and everyone listening during Ramadan. So in the collection of Bukhari, narrated by Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha, where the Prophet ﷺ said, do good deeds properly, sincerely, and moderately, and know that your deeds will not make you enter paradise. And the key thing here is the most beloved deeds to Allah, the most are the ones that are done regularly, even if constant, and even if they were little. So trying to be constant in our ibadah, even if it's a little bit, we're not going to be finishing, khatams every day, but just try and keep it consistent, and we can continue that into Ramadan, after Ramadan, inshallah. I will see everyone next week, Sunday, 1 till 2. We're going to be with a master archer, inshallah, Brother Ahmed from Australia. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.